Um, Today we're joined by Aditya Chakraborrty, who's the senior economics commentator and an opinion writer at The Guardian, where he writes a regular column and reports from around Britain and the world. And it's a roving brief that recently took him to Shildon during the North East Mayoral election campaign and prompted a column on Britain's malaise and the town that refused to die. Aditya, welcome and thank you for joining us at Southwestern News and taking the time from your busy schedule in these interesting times.
Thank you, Archie.
We'll get on to your visit to Shildon shortly, among other things, but I did want to start by just asking you a little bit about your mum and your childhood. You wrote a beautiful article about your mother when after she passed away, which was accompanied by a fabulous photograph of both of you, which just shone with love, really. Tell us a little bit about her and her influence on you growing up.
It's funny actually, given where you're sat asking me that question, that you've just prompted a memory. In 2011, my father passed away very suddenly with pancreatic cancer. And I'd been invited up to Gateshead to do a lecture for the BBC and the Sage Gateshead. And I remember the BBC were very decent, said you don't need to come if you don't want, by all means. But I thought it'd do us both good to kind of go for a trip. So I brought her with me, and we spent a weekend going around Gateshead and Newcastle, and she had a terrific time. She was and both my parents, I suppose, don't really fit the kind of the stereotypes about migrants who come to this country. They both came in the 60s separately from each other. They met in London. They came to study. And I think both of them had plans to go back to India and kind of carry on with a kind of vocational qualification. But they met here, and in fact, the story goes that my mother was doing a day job to pay for her further education, and a gentleman turned up at the town hall where she was working, and one of her colleagues said, "One of your clients is here to see you." She worked in a tax office of Camden, I think, in North London, and she looked out, and it was this man, my father, laughing to himself, who turned out he didn't have enough money to have any tax problems, of course. But he did have just enough to ask her out for a cup of tea, and they dated. And among their dates was going to Highgate Cemetery, where they went to see the tomb of Marx, and then walked in and had to shin over the gates. So a whole series of successful dates. Later, they married and had me. And my father was a lawyer. He actually wanted to be he came here to be called to the bar, and he wanted to be a corporate barrister. But I think that ambition was pretty foolhardy, given that just a few years before he'd been unable to find a bedsit in London because of racism. Yeah. So he became a human rights lawyer, representing people who were about to be deported by the Home Office back then to places like Lebanon, Pakistan, and he was basically the last port of call. He worked for charity, so as you can tell by my voice, my accent, there was very little actual money coming in, despite the fancy job title. But he would come home late at night with a briefcase full of their briefs, go through it into the early hours, and then go off to court the next morning to represent them. My mother worked as a primary school teacher, and the bulk of her career was spent in inner London, in particular in the constituency that Diane Abbott is famous for representing. And at that point, it was an incredibly tough part of Britain. She worked just off a major road that was so famous for violent crime. It was called Murder Mile. Yeah. And this is a lady who would always go to work in a beautiful sari, and had read Tolstoy, Gorky, all the Russians, and here she was kind of being shouted at by strangers, go home, all the stuff that I thought we might have left behind, but sadly it seems that we haven't. And teaching kids for decades. So they were a remarkable pair, really. I'm very lucky to have them as my parents. And they both worked with people who I think would otherwise not get a shout. That was the thing. Hackney at that time was very working class, pretty run down. It was losing people. Anyone who could afford to was leaving that borough in the 70s and early 80s. And my father was obviously representing people who were about to be turfed out of the country. And so from them, I think I learned a very valuable lesson about work having to have some higher meaning and some sense of purpose. I mean, I hope I've tried to carry some of that forward. But that's a really remarkable pair of people.
Yeah, exactly. They must have had incredible courage, like a lot of people did, I guess, at that time, and when racism was particularly rife as well. I mean, I can understand that a tiny fraction, because I do remember encountering racism once directly myself when I was living in London, because I was dating somebody who was Indian at the time, and we were walking down the street together, and a car, full of young Indian lads kind of came up and shouted a little bit of abuse and drove down the street and came back and shouted a little bit more abuse. And my heart was thumping. It was going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And all I could think about afterwards was, oh my God, imagine having to go through that every single day of your life.
Archie, there's often when people ask me about my childhood memories, which I haven't really turned over too many times, they come back. And growing up, I mean, I grew up in the early 80s in Britain, early Thatcher. And I basically saw out my transition to adulthood under the Tories in the 80s and 90s. And in that period, in particular in the 80s, the area of London which I grew up, a working class industrial area, it was very angry, very angry. Factories were closing, jobs were going, men were losing their purpose. And so my childhood was being chased by skinheads, bricks coming through windows, graffiti, obviously stuff being shouted at my mum, who I would sometimes be walking down the street with. All of the stuff that you're talking about, it was a regular feature. And I know we live in an environment now where politicians in particular, but also media commentators, sometimes think it's funny or good light entertainment to play with some of that language, some of those tropes. But I know the damage it did to people. I know the violence it left behind. I know the way that racism will often tear communities apart. And not just for people on the receiving end of it, but the poison, that the nastiness that goes with racism means that the communities which are not generally nasty, don't think of themselves as nasty, they find themselves suddenly divided, and that's a terrible place to end up in.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to something nice then. One of the things that you say in your article about your mum is you talk about her quoting, literature back to you, and she obviously had a great love for literature, and I presume that deepened your love and understanding of the written word, and the craft of writing itself. Did you write from an early age, or did you always see journalism as a career path, or were you attracted to other opportunities as a writer or as anything else?
Yeah, you're asking some good questions. I was writing at an early age, and do you know who was responsible for that? Was my mum, obviously, forcing me to write every day. Some holidays, she'd give me an exercise book and say, write down what you did yesterday. And I was like, I don't really want to do this. And she said, no, you're going to do it. You're going to write a page before you go and do it. They were both great readers of literature, and they they gave me something which is invaluable, Archie, which I would love every child in this country, in this world to have, which is a sense that everything was available to me. Nothing was off limits. So I said that my mum quoted, read the Russians. My father was an ardent reader of English lawyers, really famous English lawyers, and English politicians. He knew every single obscure Tory politician who turned up on our television in the 80s, you know, like the Bottomleys, the Lilies, all of these people who I've forgotten. So they gave me that wonderful sense. It was also, I would say, a demanding upbringing as far as literature was concerned, because I was a reasonably precocious child. I think in large part due to my upbringing and the sense of having books. So I'd go off to the library, I'd take my parents' library cards, I'd max out all the books I could bring home, carry home a huge bag full of books and start reading them for the week ahead. But my mum in particular, I remember once, she bought from the library sale, you know, when they're selling off the books that they don't want to keep on their shelves anymore. She bought a copy of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a doorstop of a book, as big as some of those you can see behind you there are. And she said, right, you're going to read that. And I was like, how am I gonna read this? But the other thing that I would also say is literature as kind of consolation for them as well. So the sense that the books and education, they weren't just there for instrumental purposes. I know people sometimes have this idea that migrants and migrant children see education purely as a means of advancement. I mentioned my father, who died of pancreatic cancer within weeks in 2011. You know, from diagnosis to death, it was 8 weeks, I think.
Wow.
And I remember when we got the diagnosis, when he was told to his face, you know, there's nothing we can do. He came home and he quoted a Bengali poet called Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, to my mother. And it was a line along the lines of, I would not wish to leave this beautiful world, but I must. And I thought, when I was told about that later that day, I thought, what kind of resilience would you need as a person to be told that you're not going to be here within days, weeks, and just to reach into poetry as a way of guiding you through it? And they were both like that. I mean, we live in an era in which education is often seen as, you know, you've got to go to university, get a degree, hopefully a STEM degree, go off and earn tons of money. And if you're not earning tons of money, what good are you to anyone? And I really resent that. That doesn't work for a lot of people. So it wouldn't work for me as a kid if I was told that was the point of education. And I think back to the way in which I was brought up, and I think some of those values are also worth preserving.
Yeah, definitely. So you're thinking about your craft itself as a journalist, you know, and you know, obviously you've spoken a lot about your mum and dad's influence in terms of, you know, on your kind of social upbringing as much as anything else as well. So how do you choose the stories that you do, and why, for example, did you decide that Shildon was a place worth visiting?
I think it's really important as a journalist, and I think this applies whichever kind of publication you're working on, whether it's a local publication or regional publication or national publication, or you're thinking you're working for a global audience. One of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to document the world in which we live, the society in which we live, the times that we're going through. And it's the thing that you know that certainly keeps me in the game, as it were, is that sense that I'm so lucky in that I can go to places, I can talk to you, Archie, I can talk to other people in Shildon, and people will talk to me as a journalist, and they'll tell me about their lives and about the lives of their town, and the kind of privileged access that you get to people as a result of that. And I don't mean just people in power, I mean all sorts of people. Is just, honestly, it's a privilege. And with that comes, I think, a sense that you want to write down and document and say what you see about the world that you're in. Now, I've written news pieces. I've done news for many years. I've done commentary. I've done feature writing. They're all different ways of doing it. I don't really see them as being, hugely different in many ways. Of course, the outcome it may be different, but in terms of what you're trying to do, you're trying to notice what's going on in the world around you. So it's an act of noticing, which I think is beautiful. But the other thing about noticing is you don't want to turn up somewhere and say, look at this place, or look at this person. Isn't it crap? Aren't they crap? Aren't they having a crap life? And that is a mistake and a trap that a lot of the media fall into. They'll go and see, I mean, you see it on YouTube exposés the entire time. They go and see a really violent place, and maybe some guy will, for Channel 4, he'll spend a week in some really tough estate, and he'll tell you, this is what it's like in this tough estate. But the point is, these places aren't exceptional. They're all part of the same country, the same world. And the job is to try and pick out what's universal, what tells you the bigger truth about the society you're in from each place that you visit. And so what I find so interesting about Shildon is if you go there, people will say, oh, it's got a bit of a reputation. It's a bit run down. There are stories in some of the less salubrious newspapers which talk about how it's had better days. And it years ago it used to have the wagon works, and that was hugely important. And when that went, a whole bunch of jobs went in what was effectively a one company town. But that situation is not exceptional. I told you I grew up in a light industrial part of London. We had a one company town as well. The company we had was called Thorn EMI, which was a huge conglomerate, and Jules Thorn, the Thorn bit of Thorn EMI, pretty much began in Edmonton, the area part of North London, which I grew up. So a lot of the factories, a lot of the manufacturing, the servicing, all the rest of that stuff was based in Edmonton. There was also a branch of it in Spennymoor as well, just down the road.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the point about a story like Shildon is it's not exceptional. It's not exceptional to say that it's seen better days, because there are so many parts of Britain which seen better days. In fact, I would say the places that have seen better days are easily in the majority. If you look at the economic statistics, the wider economic statistics, workers, the average worker is earning not very much more now than they were back in 2008. The average worker in Britain today would be entitled to earn something like £10,000 a year more if they had kept the same level of worker protection and unions as we had in the 70s. That's according to academic research. And the other thing that's really important to point out in this time when politicians talk about growth so much is every government promises that they'll give you more growth. I'm an economic specialist, as you said at the outset. I've covered every single chancellor and budget from Gordon Brown onwards. They all talk about growth, and yet every single government delivers less growth per person in real terms than the previous government. So as a country, this thing about growth and success and prosperity is really not doing the job. And you put that on the other side of things in a place like Shildon, and you think, hang on, Shildon may be a poorer town than it was, but it exists in a really wealthy country. So it's not like there's not money in Britain. Fifth, sixth wealthiest country in the world, one of the biggest economies of any of the industrial countries, huge resources whenever it wants to go to war, or an ability to raise money for companies on the stock exchange. All of this exists, right? So why is it not being shared more fairly? And when I walked around Shildon with Dave Reynolds, actually from the institute, the Railway Institute, the thing that really struck me was you were looking at a place in which there had not been an awful lot of public investment for a long time, and the secondary school had moved out of Shildon, so now you have to go out of Shildon for secondary education. But now I believe in Shildon they're also talking about a leisure centre closing down, the one next to the secondary school.
Yeah, well, it was tied to the school, so yeah.
So, but these stories, they're not exceptional. They happen everywhere, right? I could tell you other stories very similar to that of the leisure centre where I grew up, in the place where I grew up. That's just been shut down. Will not open again because the money, the cost to open it is so much. So it's not like London's got it great.
Yeah,
it's a case that particular parts of London, powerful people live, may have got it good, but lots of people do not. And in a similar case, you can go out Shildon and you can go across County Durham to wealthier parts of it, but you can also go to wealthier parts of Northumberland, and you can see there's actually a lot more affluent places next to poorer places. So it's not the case that there are just exceptional rundown localities and regions. And so that I think is a really important tale to tell of our times. That there aren't places which are left behind. It's that actually the country's choosing to cast off, to throw behind certain places, and to devote resources to other places.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered how you do square that logic of unlimited growth alongside finite resources. It's I don't quite get that personally, but your article asks the question: how do people live when money has discarded them? Which is what you're basically talking about, and that's and you say that that's perhaps a central issue of our time. So what is the answer? How can places like Shildon be lifted up again, or can they?
If you look at how much money the country has, then as a matter of logic, you'd have to say, of course, the resources exist to lift every part of Britain up. The thing we have to decide is what kind of uplift, what kind of growth, what kind of prosperity are we after? Are we after Shildon competing with Bishop Auckland, or spending more for resources, for a bit of money from a levelling up fund here, or a kindly civil servant in Whitehall there? Is that what we want? Because I don't think that gets you very far, right? Because someone will always lose from that kind of competition. And it's just about which of us can bend and roll over and do whatever it is that the money man says. Or do I want to think about what I actually need to live and what this place needs to live? Now, I think I would prefer the second, which is thinking a lot more about what's actually there in the places in where we live. So people need housing, people need access to schools and healthcare. They don't need necessarily the biggest kind of gee whiz shiny technology thing, new factory down the road, especially if it means that they have to kind of destroy what it is that they like about their town, or move hundreds of miles to go and work in a place like that. And it's as well to be realistic that the days of Braille and British Rail, they're not coming back. It's not going to happen. Thorney MI isn't going to come back to Enfield, Edmonton anytime soon either. And so what we should think about is, well, what do we have and what do we need? And start from there. And I think that actually takes us also some way towards answering a question that you lightly touched upon earlier, which is, how do you square infinite growth with finite resources? I think that's a very good question. And I'm not that into the idea of trying to get growth rates up to 2%, 3%, 4%, all these kind of numbers, which don't really mean an awful lot to people, especially when they haven't seen the proceeds from growth over the decades earlier. During the new Labour years, which is often seen as a kind of great boom period up until the banks collapsed, right? It was a massive boom. House prices zooming upwards, all the rest of it. How much of that did someone like Shildon actually see? So if you go back to a boom, do you really want that if it means that your town, your family, your street isn't going to see any of it? I'd say no. I'd say rather than go around chasing after huge growth, and remember what I said earlier about how every government delivers less growth per head than the previous government. why not go and say, actually, this is what we need. I want somewhere that looks after my parents when they get old, that doesn't just turf them out. I want to be able to get them into hospital, or get myself or my kid into hospital if we need care. And I want my kid to go to a decent school where the roof isn't leaking, and there's the head teacher isn't sending begging letters home every week.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think that's a terrible thing to want. I don't think that's out of reach. I think that's perfectly within reach. It does mean, like for instance, in transport, we concentrate an awful lot upon things like HS2 and really gee whiz projects. And I would much rather see much more investment in buses, which people actually use. Cheaper, less glamorous. You won't get the same photo opportunity as someone cutting a ribbon on a bus as you would, and someone cutting a thing on an expensive bit of train technology. But probably better.
Yeah.
Probably better.
Yeah.
People live.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we kind of live in a society which is kind of fixated a little bit on wealth and all of this, when in reality, actually, the vast majority of people are probably more interested in having decent basic services. I think you said that in your piece about Shildon as well. I think you said, was it there's no searing politics in Shildon. It's just a basic desire. It's a desire for basic services, buses that run a little bit later, and a future for the kids. And I think that would satisfy the vast majority of people, wouldn't it?
You know what, Archie? That came directly out of a meeting that was held in the Institute between locals and Jamie Driscoll, who was standing at the point to be the North East Mayor. And it was really striking to hear what the locals were actually after. It was the stuff that you were just reminding me of, and everything they asked for was not the moon on a stick. It was not fanciful. It was perfectly reasonable that they would want stuff like that, and it was just the basics of a civilized life.
Yeah.
They want the bus to run a bit later so they could go out for a drink with colleagues at work. They want their kids to be able to go to school and then get some and have some sense of employment afterwards. Not big stuff. Not as you're going off to work in the city, right?
Yeah.
Not going to work in AI or work for Google. Just some decent job.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of talk about housing as well,
Mm-hmm.
and the condition of housing.
Yeah.
In County Durham, and I thought all of these points were really well made, and it's striking how different that is from the kind of talk that you get from both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in this election campaign. Where it's about Britain being a vibrant, booming country, doing partnership with businesses, AI, all this other stuff, and it's just a million miles away from where you are and other people live.
Yeah. We'll talk about the election in a second as well, and I'm going to take you back to that visit to the Institute and the Jamie Driscoll campaign. But before I talk about that, you mentioned as well walking around with Dave Reynolds, and I saw him the other day. I was talking to him the other day, and he was saying how he had been speaking to you and how he had taken you to the town square and mentioned that the library had a plaque to Sid Chaplin on it, which you found quite exciting.
Yeah. So Sid Chaplin was born and raised, if I'm right, in Shildon, and wrote a column for The Guardian called A Northern Voice, and talked about how he was raised. I think one of his columns that I read was, I'm one of George Stephenson's bairns. And he was very proud of the role that his town had played in the industrial progress of the entire world. And it was a good salutary reminder about how important Shildon's been to the world's technology, not just not just a local story. And you get some of that also from the Railway Museum in Shildon that speaks with justified pride about the role that Shildon's played. And Chaplin did not write polemical pieces. He wrote very gentle, lyrical pieces in the most part about where he was from and the area that he covered. But it was that sense that I was imparting to you earlier of wanting to document the society that you're in and that you've grown up in. And they're beautifully written pieces. Chaplin was a remarkable writer. I think not a graduate, and one of the kind of last generation of journalists not to be a graduate, actually. Now it's almost entirely a graduate profession. We've lost something as a result. But just somebody who apprenticed his way up through trade and remained locally rooted, and it's very important. It's very important. A beautiful writer, well worth looking up. You can find bits of his writing on the internet, and you can certainly find them on the Guardian's archives on our website as well.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely going to look them up because I hadn't realised that he had written for the Guardian either. So, yeah, we'll definitely be looking at them. I spoke about that your visit during the Mayoral campaign, and specifically while Jamie Driscoll was in Shildon. He obviously eventually lost out to Labour's Kim McGuinness, who had replaced him actually as the Labour candidate, hadn't she? But what you had said was that you'd reported one person from the crowd at least saying, "At least he came." I mean, is that indicative of our current politics, that there's very little engagement from the political class with the electorate per se?
I think so, yes, and I think it's long running. And it affects particular parts of the electorate more than others. So you know that younger people tend to vote much less than older people. You also know that working class people tend to vote less than people who are well-to-do. That didn't used to be the case. Up until Tony Blair, it was the case that the working classes would turn out in almost exactly the same proportion as the middle and upper classes. Now they don't. And that could be because they feel there's not anything in it for them anymore. Certainly, if you're a young person, you might think, well, a lot of the stuff that's been talked about quadruple lock on pensions and all the rest of it isn't really for you. What really struck me about Shildon was that people, when I visited, were talking about how the town council, about half the positions among town councillors were people from two major families. And there was no suggestion that there was anything underhand that had happened. It was more a case that actually people weren't willing to volunteer to give up the time. And so they were stuck looking for people who would actually come and sit on the council. And I know that this is actually a more widespread issue than you might think. I remember in 2010, 2009, going to local Labour Party meetings who'd asked me to come along and speak about the economy, for instance, and you turn up and you'd be told, oh, this is a really, really good crowd that we've got today. Normally it's a tiny crowd. I'd say, how tiny? They'd say 4 people. And I'd say, really, 4 people? They say, barely, we often are not quora. We often not quora. And this general sense of politics kind of hollowing out and parties losing their membership. So the Tory party now has got a tiny membership. If it's in 6 figures, I'll be really surprised. The Labour Party membership, which was one of the biggest in Western Europe just a few years ago, that the membership's now nosediving, and that is dangerous. So, it is a common phenomenon now, not just in Britain, across Western Europe, that big politics is losing the people are not engaging. And yet the paradox is people are more willing to engage in politics than ever before, because they're going on their social media, whether it's their Shildon town page on Facebook or Edmonton in my case, and they're sounding off about politics left, right and centre. They're just not willing to do it in a formal institutional way as they were.
I agree. I mean, it's interesting. I kind of noticed this every year when I'm watching the general election campaign, and you've got the nighttime politics when all the results are coming through and all the panels are sitting there. And every single election, without fail, there is always a point in time when there's a discussion about political engagement and trying to get people involved in politics again. And the next time I hear that discussion is at the next general election. There's never anything done in between to try and foster that engagement at all.
My hunch would be that if Labour win this election, which, they'd be nailed on to do so, you'd have to say, I think they will want to make it the case that they enfranchise a lot more people. So I'm guessing that they might drop the voting age, and they might also make it much easier for people who are renting, for instance, to vote. But then the question will become, well, what are they going to vote for? What's different about the politics they're going to vote for? What are you going to offer them to get them out to vote? And I think that's a really good question. And so much of the way people deal with, as you say, on election night, they'll talk about, well, people need to vote more. Maybe we could make it so it's a bit like when you're voting for I'm a Celebrity and you can do it from home or whatever. But what are they actually voting for? What are you actually offering them that's different?
Yeah.
And that's a really key thing.
Yeah.
How about listening and engaging with them as politicians?
Yeah. So it's too late for this general election, particularly given it was called early. But I understand Jamie Driscoll now is looking to set up a movement of like-minded independents in the North East as a bit of a counter to the established parties. What do you think about that? I mean, do you ever see independents ousting the big two in future elections?
First past the post. The system that we have, which means that the winner takes everything, makes it very difficult to see independents breaking through in any meaningful way. There are certain politicians who you might think have sufficient name recognition to keep seats and to win votes. Jeremy Corbyn would be like perhaps the most preeminent example. In some ways, it's an odd paradox of our politics. The amount of attention that's given to Nigel Farage, who's never won anything and just travels the country trying to carpet bag seats, versus Jeremy Corbyn, who's been widely disdained by the media and yet shows every sign that he'll win Islington North as an independent and remain there for his third decade as an MP. Tells you quite a lot about how our politics likes novelty and charlatans rather than people who actually do the job of a politician. George Galloway, same thing. The guy just travels the country trying to carpet bag seats. Very gifted in many ways, but clearly not interested in local constituents. I think what Jamie's trying to do in the wake of his defeat is he's trying to do not a party. So it's not a party that's challenging Labour or the Conservatives. It's a very loose alliance of independents in their own areas who want to stand for elected office. And I think also he's playing a longer game where he's thinking, this election has been called too soon. We're not going to do an awful lot of this election. But clearly, you can see a case how in 2 years' time, the usual midterm blues set in. People are a bit fed up with Keir Starmer and asking, well, what are you going to do? These things naturally happen with any new government.
Yeah.
You couple that with the economy, which looks like it's going to remain pretty sluggish for another 5 years, whoever's in charge, and he can see an opening for himself there. How much of an opening? I don't know. What did strike me going around County Durham in the run up to the mayoral elections was I didn't see an awful lot of branding from either side. So I walked through Shildon, I didn't see Labour posters in windows. Going through the surrounding areas, you didn't see any red or blue. I wasn't seeing an awful lot of evidence of people knocking on doors either. Actually, Jamie's campaign had the most number of door knockers and kind of people willing to campaign on foot. So I would say there's an opening there, and clearly other parties and other political formations are trying to work out how to exploit that. That's what the Reform Party, that's what it's partly trying to do, and what Nigel Farage may well try and do once he's come back from having spent his quality time with Donald Trump. I dare say he'll try and break into British politics again. I'll tell you one thing. Give you another wager, Archie, is the story of this election is the Reform Party doing a lot of damage to the Conservatives.
Yeah.
I think in 2 years' time, 4 years' time, the story will be Reform, if they hang on, doing a lot of damage to the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And that will be, it will feel very different by that stage.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I would not say the long-term projection for British politics is at all stable. To my mind, we're heading to an election where Labour should get a landslide. It feels like the country's had enough to Conservatives. All the polls are showing them double-digit leads, so strong double-digit leads. The Tories have had a dramatically terrible campaign already. But beyond that, like the meltdown on the right side of the aisle, as it were, shouldn't distract us from the weakness, the underlying weakness on the left side of the aisle. Just because blue is in a lot of trouble does not mean that reds aren't in a lot of trouble too. They are. They really are.
Yeah, I mean, it feels sometimes, I think, just the way that politics works in this country, that regardless of the direction that an economy takes under the big two administrations, it always feels like that whenever there is a bit of economic trouble, that the door opens to the right-hand side rather than the left, as if, like, is it something to do with the right and the hard right still being friends of capital, while the left are possibly seen as a threat in that kind of way, and that's why that door's always closed? And is that what caused the issues with the Jeremy Corbyn campaign previously?
The really weird thing about that is, if you think about just within the context of British politics, we had a leader of the Conservative Party, a Prime Minister, who said F business.
Yeah,
Boris Johnson said that. Brexit was not something that most big business in this country wanted. And now little businesses are finding it's causing all kinds of problems with customs and tariffs, right? And Brexit was something driven by the right. On the left side of the aisle, you've got, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, or Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, what they are talking about, to greater or less extent, is some kind of relationship with business, with capital, but on a slightly changed footing. Now, John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn wanted to push that quite far. Rachel Reeves wants to push that a little bit. But they both do want to do it. I mean, it's wrong to say that Rachel Reeves will just leave business in exactly the same position. The New Deal for workers, whatever one's read on what it does and doesn't do, is an attempt to give workers a bit more of a say in their workplace. It could also be the case that you get a position where workers are given shares in their companies. I would not be surprised to see that being floated as an idea in a couple of years' time. I noticed the Lib Dems have started to talk about it this election. So, but to say that this isn't capitalism, that these are attacks on business, is wrong. It's about having a different kind of relationship with business, but not writing business out. And I don't think John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were after that either. They were not talking about having a socialist economy. They were certainly talking about having a command and control communist economy. They wanted the market to be functioning. It's just that where they drew the line was different, and it would be the same with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. And you know what, Archie? I suspect that even if the Tories came back at a certain point, they would also have to reshape the relationship, because we have a society which is plainly falling apart under the pressures of austerity for the past decade or so, and economic growth remains weak. And so somewhere we've got to find extra money to pay for things that people want in terms of healthcare and schools and so on. So how that's done, apart from praying for extra growth, I don't know, but I suspect it'll have to come through taxes.
Well, let's we'll wind down over the next couple of questions for you and let you get a little bit of rest. We'll talk a little bit. I just want to say a little bit more about the election. Obviously, just in terms of that prediction, it's looking like it's a stroll into Downing Street, doesn't it, for the Labour Party, given everything that's been going on. I mean, so, is it really a simple coronation? Are you concerned a little bit about the direction of travel of Labour? I'm thinking more about, your mum sold place in Hackney, and what's happened to Diane Abbott at the moment, and she just appears to be one of the kind of victims currently of what looks to be like an accelerated purge of the left of centre candidates, just days before the deadline for nominations. Does this raise concerns about what we can expect from a Labour administration?
So I don't. So what in the past few days alone have been a pretty remarkable period for the Labour Party. A lot of long-serving MPs have suddenly been told they're not going to be allowed to stand as Labour candidates, and others who've gone through the selection procedure have been told, actually, we want to give that seat to someone else. And people have said, well, this is about racism. The likes of Diane Abbott and Faiza Shaheen have been blocked because they're Black and Asian. Other people said it's about a purge of left. Lloyd Russell Moyle and Diane Abbott, these are left-wingers, and they're being done in as a result. To my mind, that's not primarily what it's about, although it does have that as a result. But what's actually driving as a motive is about jobs for the boys.
Yeah.
The Labour Party is run by a group called the NEC, the National Executive Committee, and they have they've been calling the shots under Keir Starmer, and and they also are the ones who've been involved in a lot of the deselections. It's remarkable how many of them have ended up getting safe seats to stand in at this election. Now, why is that bad? It's not bad because it's so unusual. I mean, Labour leaderships have done this before. They've parachuted their own favourites into territories before. It happened under New Labour, for heaven's sake. I mean, the old joke that was made to me was that half the New Labour contingent didn't even know where Darlington was before they suddenly turned up there, right? And it would be no surprise to me to see something similar this time around. But it's bad because it means that politics becomes a closed shop, and it appears like a closed shop to voters. Even if they've got no particular dog in the race, they don't care who represents them. They don't care whether it's Diane Abbott or someone else. But they can see that politics is basically an insider game. So why would they get involved? Why would they get involved in issues? And this is a country that's very, very unequal, very unequal. So now you'll also have alongside this a phenomenon in which politicians represent those who've already got power and wealth in society. And there's a lack of democracy. We're gutting the very meaning democracy in Britain, in the home of parliamentary democracy. We're gutting the meaning of it. Parliament should be made more open, not less open. The Labour Party in particular, its historic job is to open up politics to people from working class and non-traditional backgrounds. That's what it was set up for, and to give them a route into political change. If it just becomes about favourites, who knows who scratches whose back, who owes who a favour, then we're going away from that. And we're also going towards a kind of groupthink and a self-interested, serving the wealthy politics, which we saw plenty of under the Tories, to be honest. And where did that lead us? It led us to people's mates getting given contract for dodgy PPE, right?
Yeah.
That risk does open up under this kind of closed shop system. Yeah,
I think we'll go on to the final section here, which is I just wanted to ask you about something that we, Southwestern News, are currently involved in, and that's Indie Newsweek. Now, Indie Newsweek has been organised nationally by the Public Interest News Foundation. What are your thoughts about plurality of the media in this country, and especially the role of small independents? Can they survive? Can they be a counterbalance to the more politically motivated kind of establishment media class? What changes do you see arising from news deserts? What do you see the dangers arising for local communities and democracy as a whole as a result of that loss?
I think this is such an important question, Archie, and I think the project you're involved in at Southwest Durham News, I think, is so important. And independent news is of critical importance. I'll tell you for why. A large part of what I think's gone wrong in Britain in 2020s has been in train for a long time, and it's been essentially a shutting out and a silencing of voices because they're not right in the center of politics. And so if you open up any newspaper, national newspaper, or you flick on the BBC or the ITV, what you tend to get is the same merry-go-round of voices and perspectives, and there's not that much difference. And it, they're like two really long, whether it's right or left, it's like two really long established football teams trotting out onto the pitch to play each other, and all the faces, and exactly what positions they're going to take, and you know actually pretty much what the scoreline is going to be before it even begins. Right now, what really struck me about going to Southwest Durham is I had a long conversation with you before I went on the phone, as you remember, and we had conversations afterwards as well. And I read through your publications covering, 4 areas of Southwest Durham, not just Shildon. But that's a part of the country that's barely written about. And when it is written about, it's written about in this really negative monotone. Yeah. And that's not helpful. It's not helpful for people to turn up and do a kind of drive-by and say, look at this crash victim, let's do a bit of rubbernecking and see what's happened here, and then move on. There's a lot of this which makes up our news coverage, especially of areas. We live in a country of great inequalities, some of the most marked inequalities anywhere of any rich country. Part of that, not all of it, part of that is down to local inequalities. And it's really important to have a greater kind of monitoring of what's happening in localities. It's also really important to have a greater monitoring of what's happening to people from ethnic minorities, from different classes, of what's happening to women. In that respect, having really good local news is really important. And one of the things that I find sad is when I look at regional and increasingly national news in Britain, you'll see that the filleting out staff, the cuts that have been made over the years, have really taken a toll on the kind of news gathering and news reporting that they now do. That's not to point fingers or blame people there. That's just saying this is what happens, right? You take out skilled journalists, and then you bring in younger people, and you say put stuff up that does really well on the internet. Well, it's going to be the sort of stories that we know really well, and that doesn't really convey the reality of where most of us live. So I do think that it's really important to have independent news. It's really important to have a really vibrant news ecosystem, so that I know very well that what I do at a national newspaper, an international newspaper like The Guardian, is informed by what people like you do at a local level. Like you do the local monitoring, you've got the local intelligence, which I rely upon to read, and which your readers also read. If we don't have that, well, we drift into a world in which there are no facts anymore, and it's a kind of post-truth. I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like Donald Trump emerges in an era in which he's a media creation, let's not forget, in which the media has lost so many news journalists in America and has lost so many news titles, right? So he emerges in this era in which people just really cut off from news. And so then they'll think, well, news is just showbiz, and here's this guy who's better at showbiz than anyone else, right? We could well end up in a similar kind of position in Britain. I would not be too complacent about it. So it's really important work, not just in terms of news, not just in terms of people feeling informed and entertained, but also in terms of making us all feel like we're in democracy. We're in a democracy and we can have our say and find out what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great. Well, I think, Aditya, I've kept you long enough, and thank you for your patience through a few breaks and the connection there as well. I just want to finish off by saying thank you for your time today. I know you haven't been feeling 100%, so it's even more appreciated that you've given us your time. I'm wishing you and your family a speedy recovery, and particularly in advance of what I guess is going to be a busy time ahead for you. And I look forward to reading your work as the election campaign progresses.
Archie, thank you so much. And I should just say that I had intended to visit Shildon in the run up to the election, although before it was called early. So I'm still intending to come up again before the end of the year and to follow up some of the leads and some of the stories, and just revisit the place. So I'm hoping that you and I get to meet, but also I get to meet other people in Shildon.
Yeah, great. Yeah, you will get the coffee pot on.
Yeah.
Nice one.
You
That's
take
great.
care.
Thanks. Take care. Take care, Aditya.
Bye.
Bye now.